Hi, so I'm Sam Larusa. I'm a biochemistry PhD student, and this is my class, How Not to Die in a Chemistry Lab. So usually I teach this class in person, obviously, and with a co-teacher. So this is a bit different than I'm used to, but I didn't want to just put up the PowerPoint and have you guys look at it because I feel like this class, it's best when it is taught. I have a lot of fun teaching it, and I found that students have a lot of fun taking it usually, partly because there's a lot more to this class than just what's essentially a pretty boring deck of slides and some fairly interesting chemicals, but they're nothing you couldn't Google. So really my goal with this class right now is to try to do this class justice for all of you who are currently stuck at home, if you're watching this in spring 2020. And I really just want to make sure that I get to make it as fun as possible, despite the fact that you guys aren't actually in the room with me. And so, yeah, I hope that you all enjoy this. And so to start with, I like to start the class off kind of slow, just talking about kind of how to identify whether or not you actually have something dangerous in front of you. So I'm not able to cover every dangerous substance ever made. That's impossible. People are dreaming up new horrible things every day. It's one of the fascinating things about science is people apparently can't stop making stuff that is incredibly, incredibly dangerous. So instead, once people actually figure out how they're dangerous, they slap these labels onto things. Usually the labels are long and have lots of words on them, or maybe they tell you to go look at something called a safety data sheet, but everything hazardous, whether it is a tiny little bottle of like a little bit of like, I don't know, anything like just a couple milligrams of something up to like an entire semi-truck full of something are going to be labeled in a way that makes it easy for anyone looking at it, especially first responders, to figure out what's going on and what these dangers are. So that's where it's a good place to start, because this will tell you if you see nothing else, this will tell you kind of what you have to be concerned about when you're working with anything in particular. So, like I was saying, these are really easy to understand at a glance. In a lab, you really want to make sure you kind of pay attention to these things. You get used to what chemicals you're working with usually, but you do want to know what's going on here, just because you want to keep your safety first. You can't do science too easily if you wind up... Well, you can't do science if you're dead. That's a pretty good rule for scientists that everyone needs to remember. The other places you'll find these labels is on those safety data sheets, and also just when you're Googling something. If someone's like, oh, there's this chemical, and it shows up in the news, and you're like, okay, well, what is this? Is this actually dangerous, or is this just somebody rambling on about something that they don't understand? And so this actually is just a cutout from Wikipedia. I just took it off their website for a chemical called hydrazine, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. And this just kind of gives you an overview of what you have to worry about, just in a nice, easy to understand pictorial format. Also, like I was saying, you'll have like bottles of stuff. They don't usually have this diamond there, but they'll have these labels, these GHS, these red and white GHS labels that will tell you what you have to worry about if you happen to find a little bottle in the back of something that you don't know what it is, which happens all the time actually, and it's not always safe stuff. So to start with, this is actually, to back up a little bit, this was the NFPA diamond. This is I think it's a strictly American thing. It's the National Fire Protection Association diamond. And it's just a simple pictogram for first responders to go, okay, if I'm going in there, if there's a fire, if there's someone injured or something, and I have to go in there, no one's helping me, what do I have to worry about? And these consist of colored diamonds numbered 1 to 4. So these 3 colored diamonds here always have something in them. So 1 is least dangerous, 4 is most dangerous. I think it might even go down to 0 if there's absolutely nothing you have to worry about. So like this one here, you can see that it has pretty high danger to health, so it's got a 3 in this health hazard box. The red box is pretty obviously flammability, so this thing is like fairly flammable. And then this yellow box here is for reactivity, so whether or not it plays nice with other chemicals. And so it's like fairly reactive. And that white diamond here is actually for other information. So this one says don't put water on it. This means that if you're putting out a fire or something, you might have an issue where there's it's reactive with water, for example. So that white diamond there, right here. So moving forward, so the global harmonized system, on the other hand, actually tells you interesting stuff. So the NFPA diamond is just kind of like is this somewhat dangerous? Is there something I have to worry about if you're charging through a door or something? You're like, okay, well, there are these sorts of problems in this room, because I'll often put these on doors going to laboratories. I think every lab actually has these. But if you want to know what your specific hazards are, you really want to be looking at these GHS symbols. So these are the 9 really standard GHS symbols, at least a couple of years ago. These were like the symbols. And so they number hazards 4 to 1, where 1 is the most dangerous, exactly the opposite of the NFPA diamond. I have never seen GHS numbering in the US. I think this might not be present just because it would confuse anyone who's familiar with the NFPA diamond. But for a globally harmonized system, at least in the case of the US, this doesn't make any sense. So these symbols here, though, so the first one's explosive. This fairly obvious. There's a thing like flying apart. So, if it explodes, we'll go into what that means later, but you'll see this label here. If it's flammable, really, really obvious symbol is something on fire. It's just flames. It's self-explanatory. So oxidizers, on the other hand, are this O on fire. So oxidizers mean that they accelerate fires. So actually, if you take something that's not particularly flammable, say Velcro, and you put it in a container of pure oxygen, it will burn beautifully. There was actually a video, I should probably post that in this class's, at least in the video description or in the class's materials, of someone putting oxygen on Velcro and lighting it on fire. And the reason they chose Velcro is, unfortunately, during the Apollo missions, when they were setting them up, Apollo 1 was like a test. They had like a test rig, and the thing had a pure oxygen atmosphere, and there were 3 astronauts in it trying how to use this stuff, and then the thing caught on fire, and it was a pure oxygen atmosphere full of Velcro. And so, tragically, all of the astronauts died, and but people were like, okay, none of these materials are flammable, and then they had it in a really strong oxidizer-present environment, and then all of a sudden just everything burned. So most modern spacecraft have mixed gas atmospheres that are not pure oxygen for precisely that reason, because you don't want everything and its mother setting on fire. Then the next one here, this is not like a sorority paddle or something. This is a compressed gas cylinder. That's what this symbol means here. So anything under pressure is in and of itself dangerous. So that's kind of how a rocket works. If you have something under pressure and you have all that gas suddenly leave out one direction, well, you have an equal and opposite reaction where the other thing just goes, the actual container can go flying. And so any compressed gas cylinder could become a missile under the right circumstances. So that's why there's a specific GHS symbol specifically for compressed gas. The next image is very evocative. It's for corrosives. So you have this picture of like a flat surface, but also a hand being eaten away by some chemical. We'll go into corrosives in a little bit. Then the skull and crossbones for toxic stuff. I think we're probably all familiar with that at this point. And then we get to these 3, which are they're not the toxic symbol, but they all are something you kind of want to be aware of. So this harmful symbol here means that something in there may hurt you. So it could just be an irritant. It could be something that you don't want to get in your eyes, which again is pretty common. It could be like a kind of unestablished health danger that it's immediate. The health hazard symbol, on the other hand, applies to stuff that is likely to cause long-term health damage, usually. So like carcinogens, so anything that causes cancer is a carcinogen, and these will have these health hazard warnings on them. These are the sort of thing that maybe immediately aren't incredibly concerning, but if you're working with them every day, this could eventually kill you. Hepatotoxins, so liver toxins, are also common health hazards that you will encounter in a lab. And then finally, this environmental hazard symbol here. So you've got a dead tree and a dead fish. And this is stuff that you don't want to get into the water supply. So these are things that you really want to be careful with when you're disposing of them. So anything that has this symbol on it does not go down the drain. Just a general good rule in a lab. That can also apply to anything else here, even if something's not labeled. But this means like, do not pour this down the drain. Do not throw this in the trash. Potentially, this could be something that could cause long-term harm to the environment. Cool. So now that we've worked out what all these symbols are and like, what are the sorts of problems that the powers that be think you have to worry about in a lab, we can actually start talking about like some specifics. So I want to start off with poisons. As a biochemist, this is kind of the area that I'm most familiar with. And the dictionary definition of a poison is a substance with an inherent property that tends to destroy life or impair health. That's kind of vague, though. I mean, that could also apply to, like, I don't know, if it wasn't substance, that could also be like a hammer. Could actually be anything at all. And our definition of this, on the other hand, is a chemical that breaks a crucial biochemical system. So what this means is that your body is a system of chemical reactions. That's just most things that are, if they're not like clearly like a physical thing, then there's probably a chemical reaction driving it. And we are just lots and lots and lots of them. And those can be messed up. You throw a different chemical into this reaction, it's not going to work the same way. So the way you can quantify how dangerous a poison is, the typical way of doing this is what's called the LD50. So this is the lethal dose. And so this is the dose at which 50% of individuals die per given exposure route. So this is usually expressed in milligrams of poison per kilograms of body mass. The bigger you are, the more poison it takes to kill you, generally speaking. This is usually established using laboratory animals, so this is not super common for everything. There's not LD50s out there for everything out there. There are also other LD50s established by, unfortunately, some pretty evil regimes out there in the past have actually done human testing of LD50s. And this, if you ever see human testing, it was usually a Nazi experiment, which is concerning, but it's still data, and so sometimes that information is still given out. So some examples of LD50s. So cyanide has an LD50 of 1.52 milligrams per kilogram if you ingest it. So this means that it's highly unlikely to be killed by a milligram of cyanide. So a milligram is actually a fairly small amount, but, so like say you weigh 50 kilograms, then it takes roughly 75 milligrams of cyanide to have a lethal dose. Nicotine is half of that. So it just goes to show you could take in more cyanide than there is nicotine that people smoke, say, on a regular basis and still be okay. Water, just because everything has a lethal dose, it has a recorded lethal dose of greater than 90 milliliters per kilogram in rats. So everything in a high enough concentration could eventually kill you. So the phrase, the dose makes the poison, is really important to remember when it comes to poisons. A little bit of something probably won't kill you, unless it's one of those like long-term health hazards. This is not strictly true for everything, but like most of the time stuff you encounter in the environment, you're going to have a little bit of it, everyone's going to have a little bit of it, and it's not going to kill them. Other measures of toxicity. So LC50, this is the lethal concentration. So this is in parts per million. This is particularly important with gases, things that you'd be inhaling. And this is like usually established. There's like also like hazardous concentrations and stuff. So that there's only a certain amount you want to be encountering in an environment. And then there's another way of measuring toxicity, which is fixed dose procedure. So substance given at one of 4 doses, and then which one produces symptoms but not death. So lethal dose or lethal concentration, that's about dying. But obviously, not everyone who comes into contact with the poison is going to die, and there are other things that happen even if you don't die. It's like, okay, well, they didn't die, but like often that doesn't mean something bad hasn't happened, just generically. So the simplest, one of the most famous poisons, and one of my favorite ones to discuss, is cyanide. So this is actually um, one of the best poisons to talk about in the context of biochemistry. It's a great way actually to get into biochemistry, just to learn about these sorts of things. I used to teach a class on the mechanisms behind poisons, and is that was like a really just a great way to introduce biochemistry. So cyanide is how respiration breaks. So you're breathing, and breathing is obviously important. But what breathing does is it brings in oxygen for this electron transport chain process in your body that allows you to produce ATP from food. And so, well, ATP from stored energy or food or whatever, like the actual glucose or sucrose or whatever that your body is taking in. And so cyanide acts on this. So what the way the electron transport chain works is so in respiration you break down glucose and whatever. The glucose is just the stereotypical thing you talk about, but all foods that contain calories eventually can be used to produce energy. So other stuff happens, other chemistry in the body is happening to create these chemicals NADH and FADH2. And so those things are they're like high energy molecules that transfer electrons into this series of proteins. And these series of proteins then exchange these electrons and use that energy of pushing electrons through to like a final electron acceptor to pump protons across a gradient, so across a membrane, a bit like pumping water up a hill, and then they put it through a rotor called ATP synthase. And this process produces a ton of ATP, which is the kind of the energy currency of your body, and this in turn allows you to live. And the way they get rid of these electrons when they're done with them is they put them into oxygen, this electron transport chain. Every process like this, well, every electron transport chain is constantly pumping electrons in oxygen, making water. And what cyanide does is cyanide actually has a stronger affinity for this protein here, so it sticks to it really, really good and doesn't come off. And that's all it does. Is it's not particularly flammable, it's not particularly reactive. All it does is it just jams itself in where oxygen is supposed to go. This whole system halts, and you die as if you weren't breathing. In the case if you were to die of cyanide poisoning, it's pretty much the same as just not taking in oxygen. And there are other molecules that will actually compete off cyanide, so they bind better, but they don't stay on as long. And that's like how you can treat cyanide poisoning. But it works pretty quickly because it's like you're not breathing, and the whole process of cellular respiration speeds us up. On the other hand, you can have other molecules like dimethylmercury that don't act so quickly. Dimethylmercury is a neurotoxin. And mercury in general is a neurotoxin. So mercury poisoning has neurotoxic effects, but mercury usually can't get into your blood. It's a metal. In case you haven't heard of this, like something like if you eat like a penny or something and it goes through your digestive tract, it just comes right out the other end. There's not really a way to make metals in their normal metallic form bioavailable, so like available to your body. But dimethylmercury, on the other hand, is mercury, but it's got these methyl groups, so this carbon stuck to hydrogens on either side of it. And what that does is it makes it greasy. And so what happens then is it can cross the blood-brain barrier, it can go right through your skin. It's very, very available to your nervous system, and then it just wreaks havoc on it. And it can also cross latex gloves, which is unfortunate because this was discovered by accident. And mercury poisoning takes a really, really long time to take effect, and your brain just slowly deteriorates. And there was a woman who was a researcher at Dartmouth up in New Hampshire, and this was in the 90s, and she was working on dimethylmercury. So I think she was using it actually as a standard for something. I think she was a toxicologist, and they used this as like a standard or something. And she was working with latex gloves, spilled on her gloves. Like, okay, well, it's just on my gloves. Kept working, and it eventually killed her like 7 to 9 months later. So super unfortunate. And people do not use dimethylmercury anymore for like anything. They've switched to other stuff. I don't think there's even necessarily producers of dimethylmercury, at least not in the U.S. It's not like a particularly useful molecule, so it's not something you would encounter, but it is incredibly, incredibly dangerous. It's also apparently fairly flammable. It's also an environmental hazard, besides just being toxic. So it also sticks around. Mercury is a pretty big environmental toxin. It doesn't go away too easily.